Hello, wildlifers. I'm Helen Loffland, and I'm with the Institute for Bird Populations, and I'm happy to be at the 2021 Wildlife Society meeting virtually. Today, I'm going to talk about hydrologic restoration and persistence of willow flycatchers at Meadows in the Sierra Nevada, California. This is a project that the Institute for Bird Populations and our partners at the Truckee River Watershed Council have been working on really for about 9 years. So the objectives of this project were basically to use this great existing baseline data that came from the willow flycatcher demography study that happened between 1997 and 2010, and use that to basically then look at the response of willow flycatchers to hydrologic meadow restoration that occurred after the demography study, and see what the response was by this population that's been studied for many years in the Sierra Nevada, and that's sort of known as this stronghold for this declining Sierra Nevada willow flycatchers. So two of the meadows that we have in our study were the experimental sites. Those are the two meadows that were restored in 2009 and 10. And then we had 8 unrestored meadows that we used as controls. We had 13 years of pre-restoration data, which came from that demography study. And then 9 years of post-restoration data that we've been collecting since about 2011. So this project did have some constraints, small population, both from a biological standpoint as well as a statistical standpoint. We already have a well-documented ongoing decline in willow flycatchers in this area. So we're trying to tease apart the effects of restoration from sort of these population changes that are already happening. And then we had some imperfect survey coverage because we basically are trying to compare to a project that was already completed and using different funding sources to get there. But nonetheless, so these are our 11 study sites. The black dots are the restored sites. The Upper Parazo Meadow was the first one to be restored in 2009, as I said, and then the Middle Parazo Meadow was the next one to be restored in 2010. You can see the rest of these sites are sort of scattered around within, 10, 15 kilometers of one another. Okay, so for the methods, so for all these sites and all years of monitoring had at least 2 things occur there. We had broadcast surveys following the Bombay et al. Protocol, which is basically 2 visits per season, stations 50 meters apart, and broadcasting willow flycatcher songs for about 6 minutes per station. Then in addition, we had some degree of territory monitoring occurring at all of these sites, basically following that you'd find in the Mathewson et al. Paper, which I show here at the bottom of the screen. And this is the part that varies a little bit during the demography study. Obviously, the monitoring of territories was very intensive. And then after that, after restoration, we still at least went to each of these sites where we detected a singing bird and broadcast surveys and determined pair status, tried to map out territory locations, but some of the other nest type monitoring, which I'm not reporting on here today, we did not continue with that aspect. So now this is just sort of showing you again what our survey effort was. You can see in green, that was a demography study. We had good coverage of all the sites in all the years. The purple are basically when we were doing really more of just a broadcast survey with basic territory mapping. Those were multiple different projects funded through the Truckee River Watershed Council that IBP did, as well as surveys that IBP did for the Forest Service that were sort of their NEPA compliant surveys. In 2016, we were able to kind of up our game a little bit through really some of the same funding sources, but adding in multiple funding sources and a graduate student where we were able to do the broadcast surveys, the territory mapping, and a little more in-depth nest searching and territory monitoring. Let's see, so for the methods in terms of the restoration that occurred, these 2 sites that were treated had pond and plug restoration, which is a partial channel fill method. Late fall of 2009 for the upper meadow, as I said, late 2010 for the middle meadow. These photos show you the middle meadow. They're slightly different perspective from the same location. I've shown the yellow lines that link the 3 different sets of trees together so you can kind of set up your perspective. Also note that the snow on the mountains in the background, we're at basically the same level of runoff, sort of peak runoff in both of these photographs. And so in 2009, you can see the water within the channel is really restricted to the river channel itself, versus in 2018, after restoration, you can see that water during peak flow is really spreading out across the entire meadow system and re-wetting the whole meadow. And so that's just one thing I wanted to show you in terms of how habitat changed with this restoration. So for analysis, what we did was three basic things. One is we just looked at the actual number of territories and how those changed over time at each of the individual 11 study sites. We looked at the study sites all pooled together and looked at the number of territories per hectare, so density sort of across time, to look at that local trend. And then we used a general linear mixed model to examine whether the willow flycatcher population density showed a response to the restoration activity. And that's using that before-after control impact framework. And part of why we switched over to looking at territories per hectare instead of just raw territory numbers is because some of these sites are really different in size. The restored sites are around 100 hectares. Some of the control sites are also about 100 hectares in size, but some of them are also much smaller, more like 10, 20, 30 hectares. So we really wanted to kind of account for that difference. Oh, so let's just jump into results then. So these are the first set of control sites. What you can see is that over time, we did have these declines that occurred at almost all the sites. Many of them, I'd say, I think 6 out of 11 sites basically went to basically 0 territories over the period of this project. Yeah, and so then this slide's also more of those reference sites. However, the control sites, the treated sites, the restored sites are the ones with the orange boxes around them. And we did put the red line, the horizontal line is showing you when restoration occurred at these sites. And so you'll see again, population declined at basically all but one of these, and the Stampede site there in the middle that has a tiny increase is kind of an interesting one that I can't quite explain. But you're seeing basically the same pattern, with the exception that the 2 restoration sites really did not drive down to 0 territories, staying more in the 4 to 5 to 6 territories per site. This slide shows you that pooled data for territories per hectare across the entire area. And so again, we're looking at what the demography study found, which is about an 8% decline per year in the Central Sierra area. And so that seems to still be ongoing. And then in this slide, this is where we actually get into sort of the nitty-gritty of that before-after control impact work, where, you know, it's actually some good news, because I've been showing you slides with declines, and now we have opportunity to see something where with this Bakke analysis, we're finding that the restored sites here on the far right, they had really a significantly smaller decline than what was in the control site. So that's really showing you that this restoration is making a difference in terms of the ability of the species to persist at the site. So I just want to now move kind of into discussion of what this means. So one, as it's kind of obvious from the slides, willow flycatchers are still declining. It's still something that we need to be concerned about. We haven't found, you know, just restoring 2 meadows isn't the silver bullet that's going to reverse declines in the Sierra. But we did see that restored sites had significantly smaller declines than unrestored sites. So that really does suggest that these hydrologic restoration projects, kind of at a large scale, may buffer some of the other negative conditions that may be behind some of the root causes of decline. Another thing that we noted is that restoration at the occupied sites did not result in any kind of apparent immigration of flycatchers away from the sites due to the disturbance, which I think is important to know, because with restoration, the first thing we want to do is make sure we're not doing any harm to the species at risk we're trying to help. Other things we noticed, many long-standing territory locations that were occupied year after year after year continued to be occupied after restoration. But there was also a number of locations where there had been willow, but the meadow was very dry. Well, when we re-wetted the meadow with restoration, willow flycatchers actually moved in and colonized some of those spots. So we did see that response to change in habitat. So I guess the next question is, why might these restore sites have had these smaller declines? One thing is that wetter meadows may reduce mammalian predation. That's something that we started looking at way back in the demography study, and we kind of formed that hypothesis and began the process of testing it, and did see that kind of a response, that a lot of the edge predators really don't like to go out into these really wet, flooded areas. So we're thinking that restoration may have reduced that mammalian predation of nests. Um, Also, something that we haven't tested yet, but I would love to look at more, is that wetter sites really may increase your total abundance of insect prey. You have more varied standing waters and running water situations. You have lots of aquatic emergent vegetation, things that really might bolster your invertebrate population. That way, help with reproduction, help with adult survival, those sorts of things. And then another aspect that could be going on here is that if predation or less predation results in fewer nest failures, that means that the willow flycatchers are successful more often on their first nest attempts. And that means that both the young that are produced and the adults have more time to build fat stores prior to fall migration. And migration really is one of the periods that we think is very critical for this species, and that is where a lot of the losses are occurring right now. And so with that, really, I just want to thank the partners. There's so many here. The U.S. Forest Service basically either directly or indirectly has provided funding and support and collaboration for over 20 years on this project, and we really can't thank them enough. My co-authors on the original demography study papers, Dr. Heather Mathewson and Dr. Michael Morrison, of course, we couldn't have done this comparison if they hadn't, been involved with that initial demography study. Scott Dietrich was a great grad student that we worked with in the last couple of years. Truckee Donner Land Trust, Weber Lake Ranch, Nature Conservancy, Rand's family, McClatchy family, Station, Creekfield Station, and well over 50 field technicians provided data and helped us kind of patch this together. And I think, addition to being happy about seeing these really somewhat positive results of restoration, it's nice to see that this project that's a labor of love for a lot of people to actually come to fruition. And it's a testament that sometimes you have to pursue imperfect efforts with imperfect funding and imperfect surveys. And if you have the time to put into it, you really still can detect change over time. And I think it's a valuable thing for us to kind of keep pursuing. So with that, thank you very much. All right.